Some people ask about this Blackbird, how fast does it really fly? Well, the muzzle velocity on a military rifle, that bullet leaves that chamber, is traveling about 2,800 feet per second. The Blackbird, we flew at 3,000 feet per second. So when they say we flew faster than a speeding bullet, it was true. And the amazing part of it is this. Muzzle velocity of a bullet starts declining and it has short distance. We flew it for at least 1 hour and significantly more at that speed, faster than a speeding bullet. So we go from here to Florida in 1 hour. Now, the purpose mostly of this talk here is to make tribute to not the guys in these pressure suits like myself. This was taken after we launched the first missile from the YF-12. A missile, mind you. So I'm going to tell you the differences between all of the airplanes, 4 different versions. But most important is to make tribute not to the guys in the cockpit, but all of these people here who maintain the airplane, the blue suiters and contractors as well. They're the people who made this thing happen, and they never get the credit. Those of us in the cockpit got the medals, the pictures, the recognition. They seldom got the recognition they deserve. Now, people here in white suits, they're the ones who are specialists in pressure suits, because all of our flights was in a full pressure suit, similar to the ones that the astronauts wear. And they were responsible for fitting us, caring for us, suiting us up, putting us in the cockpit, taking us out of the cockpit, and keeping us comfortable. Now, the reason these guys were so valuable is that the Blackbird was something that was built out of titanium. No other airplane was ever built out of titanium. 99% of the total structure in the Blackbirds was titanium. The reason was they needed a metal that would be heat resistant, more so than aluminum. And we'd be from low temperatures on the ground to very high temperatures in flight, over 600 degrees. The unique thing about this is that working on something like this, first of a kind, is these people had to be trained. They had to use special tools. For example, the tools that you used on an aluminum airplane could not be used on this because they had to be cadmium free. Anything that had cadmium in it would help destroy the titanium. They didn't know that at first. But Kelly Johnson, the designer of the airplane, learned that quickly, that parts were starting to rot, and learned that you couldn't use normal tools. These people had to learn all about that. They also had to learn about special fuels, which we used. Not JP4, which you have in a typical jet that you fly in a commercial or any other military jet, but we used JP7. It had a very, very low flash point, such that it did not have any problems on the ground combusting, because this airplane literally leaked on the ground. It was kind of embarrassing when you saw the airplane land. They put pans under the belly of the airplane, and that was because the fuel would be dripping out. And it's one of the few things that Kelly Johnson, the marvelous designer, was never able to perfect, and that was a sealant around the fuel tanks that could withstand the temperature variances from very cold, very hot on the ground, and very cold on the ground, to 600 degrees in flight. But it still leaked, and they never perfected it. Now, back in the late 1950s, there was an airplane flying over Russia and China, which was called a U-2. You probably remember when Gary Powers was shot down. Well, Kelly Johnson, the designer of that airplane, knew that we needed an airplane that could survive the missile launches by the enemies over which we were flying. And the U-2, they knew would be vulnerable. So the CIA started in 1960, and they ordered 12 A-12s. Now, they were owned and operated by the CIA, not by the Air Force. Owned, operated, flown completely by the CIA. It was highly, highly classified. In order to get onto the program, you had to go through special security clearances. Now, the CIA didn't clear many Air Force people. For example, it might be hard to believe, the Chief of Staff of the Air Force was not cleared on this program. So, about halfway through the production of these A-12s, here, the Air Force then learned of the existence, and they felt they needed an airplane that could be similar to the A-12, but that would not be a reconnaissance vehicle, which the A-12s were, but would be an interceptor, would carry missiles, not cameras. So the Air Force built 3 YF-12s right in the middle of that production line and commenced flying them. Now these airplanes, all in the left column, were all built in Burbank, California, at Kelly Johnson's Skunk Works. They were built, put together there, then taken apart piece by piece, put on trucks, large sections, and taken by road to Groom Lake, which is Area 51, a highly classified, clandestine location. And that's where they first flew. Now at the bottom you see these M21s. That's another version of the airplane, and it was a reconnaissance vehicle. I'll talk about that a little bit later. Now, after the airplanes on the left were flying, the Air Force felt they needed their own airplane. And there came the SR-71, which is this vehicle. Again, totally reconnaissance. Now, the difference between this airplane and YF-12 and the A-12s is that the A-12s were single cockpit, only one pilot. Whereas the YF-12s had a 2-place airplane, as did the M21s, and the SR-71s are also 2-seaters. The tasks for one man to handle all of the equipment just was too much, they found on the A-12s. So, first flight on the A-12 was in 1962, 2 years after the contract was given to Lockheed. An amazing feat to design, build, put together, and flight test the airplane in 2 years of the first flown Mach 3 vehicle. Mach 3, 2,200 miles an hour. The YF-12 first flew in 1963. President Johnson, in 1964, announced the existence of an airplane that could fly 2,000 miles an hour plus. And he said they were stationed at Edwards Air Force Base. Well, that was not true at all. They were really at Groom Lake, Area 51. So as soon as Johnson made the announcement, the airplanes were rushed into Edwards Air Force Base, where he said they were. Interestingly, when they flew out of Groom Lake, they flew at speed and at Mach 3 at high temperature. They quickly landed at Edwards, taxied into a hangar, and the airplane was so hot, it set off the sprinklers. So we gave them a good bath. Interesting thing about the YF-12s, after it was announced by President Johnson, is that it truly then became a good cover for the A-12s that the CIA was still flying. So this A-12 was never announced And it then later flew missions over Vietnam, over the Pueblo incident. The way they did it is they deployed to Okinawa at Kadena and flew the missions out of Kadena over Vietnam, China, and over the Pueblo. But the YF-12 was a very good cover because publishing was going on, people were taking pictures of it, and the real good cover for the A-12s was that they were flying true combat missions, photographing the enemy. I won't go into great detail about the YF-12 except that it had a different configuration. And you'll notice the nose of the airplane was different because it had to house a radar, and it also had to house missiles. Now when you put that nose on an airplane that was not normally going to have that nose, it caused lateral instability. So because of that, they had to put these fins on the back end. You see these 3 fins? And that was to keep the airplane stable. So that's a major difference between the A-12 and the SR-71 and the YF-12, were these fins. Well, we talk a lot about the speed of the YF-12 and the SR-71 and the A-12, but there was another unique technology developed only for this airplane, and that was a radar that could look down and not see clutter. There's a picture of the missile that it carried, 800-pound missile, which we launched at least at 35 to 40 miles from targets. Now, what's unique about that is that it was a first of a kind with no ground clutter. You don't see this clutter normally regular airplanes see when the radar is looking down at the ground. It was clutter-free. The only thing it could detect was an airplane that was moving. And if it wasn't moving, it wouldn't be detected. So it was a brand new technology. And this is what the airplane actually did. And here's a typical mission we flew many times out of Edwards Air Force Base, right here, climbing towards Las Vegas and around Prescott, and then over to the ocean, where there'd be a drone flown by the Navy for us, and we'd launch missiles, head-on shots. Now typically what we were doing is we're flying at 3.2 Mach, 75,000 feet. The detection on a drone, small drone, pilotless airplane, would be at about 125 miles. And the missile would be launched at around 35 miles. And the tail just comes straight down, hitting the target. Now, there was a problem over the ocean here, and that is that whole area had to be cleared. And the Navy did a great job clearing the waters for any boats or any other airplanes in that vicinity, because you didn't want to strike a vehicle unknowingly. So the Navy cleared that all out, except for several missions we had a problem. Russian trawlers that were stationed in that area. Well, we aborted many missions because we couldn't launch, because that trawler was listening to our radar and our conversations. Well, the Navy came to the rescue again, Admiral. They put a EA-6B aircraft jammer. They went right over that trawler during our missile launch and jammed the trawler so that it would be blind. Could not see anything, couldn't hear anything. They not only jammed their receivers, but also jammed their receiving the radios. So that was a typical mission. We flew 5 missile launches, all very successful. The Strategic Air Command was beginning to be quite concerned about our capabilities, because they're saying, if we have this capability, might the Russians also have such a capability? And would our bombers be vulnerable to such a pulse Doppler system. So they said, let's see if you can do that against a real bomber. Let's see if you can fly it really low over water. The only place we could do that at the time was at Eglin Air Force Base. So we flew to Eglin and launched the airplane from Eglin, and this time we had a QB-47. You might be familiar with the Strategic Air Command had bombers called B-47s. Big vehicle, but it was a drone. So we flew that drone at 1,200 feet, and we had the missile launch, another successful hit. The Strategic Air Command said, well, all right, you did that over water. Could you do it really over land? We said, okay, an additional challenge. So they took the QB-47 to Holland Air Force Base in the White Sands Missile Range, which you see here over New Mexico. And we then flew the drone to as low as they could fly it, 500 feet. We were at 3.2 Mach, another great success, complete hit. So they were proven that we better be watchful of the Russians, because they might one day, which they later did, develop such a system. We then said, well, we did that against an airplane. What would we do against a missile? A cruise missile or something flying very fast. So the only way to duplicate that is we had an SR-71 coming here from Seattle. It was coming down here at 80,000 feet. We were in a YF-12. We did a head-on shot, or it's typical for a pseudo-missile launch against very, very high speed. So now we're closing at 6.4 Mach. That's around 4,200 miles a minute. Two bullets literally collided, and it was successfully done. Interestingly, I was in the YF-12 at the time, and the SR-71 was at 80,000, but they weren't quite sure if we had enough separation at 5,000 feet head on. So the SR-71 guy eased it up to about 82,000. We put ours down to maybe 73 to make sure we had plenty of separation. Now you can't see each other. What we did do, though, is we each dumped fuel at around 30 miles apart. When we dumped fuel, it made a contrail, just like you see in the sky, the night white balloon behind the airplane. With that, we could see the other airplane, and that is an astounding event, to see two airplanes closing twice the velocity of a bullet. Then came 1965, May 1st, 1965, and the Department of Defense told us we could be allowed to break the world speed records, which we did. Flew 3 flights that day. The only trouble was we were constrained by Secretary McNamara, who was the Secretary of Defense. He said, you will not set the speed record much above 2,000 miles an hour, which was quite dismaying to us, because we knew we could fly a lot faster. We didn't understand his strategy. His strategy was this. He knew by secret information that the Russians had an airplane which was capable of almost equal speeds. So he wanted us to set the record at a constrained speed so that the Russians would come back and break the record, and then we in turn would, a year or two later, come back and really let the airplane go. And sure enough, they did. The Russians broke the speed record, and a year later, the SR-71s came back and set the new world speed record and the new altitude record. And that was around 2,200 miles an hour and 85,000 feet. So while we were dismayed at the time, his strategy was valid, and we lured the Russians into it. Speaking of the Russians, it's kind of interesting. They were our stalwart enemy. Now, when we were building the airplanes, or Kelly Johnson was building the airplanes, We didn't have any titanium in the United States. We just didn't have any. So where did we get it from?
Russia.
Out of the Russians. Now, they didn't know what it was being used for. It was purchased by a third or fourth agent, shipped into Burbank. That's how it was used. The titanium sponge came from the Russians. Well, that's kind of all the whole story. I'll be happy to answer any questions because there are some unique things that happen that you won't be able to see on the internet. And I'll tell you a cute story about Kelly Johnson and the Russians. He went to the Paris air shows every 2 years, which they had. And at those meetings, he'd see the Russian designers, his counterparts. And they always traded information or little pins with each other. Friendly, but non-revealing. One of the designers asked Kelly, he said, you know, how do you restart an engine at 75 to 80,000 feet? Because they were having trouble with an engine flame out. They couldn't, the light air, they couldn't start the engines. Kelly said, well, we have a special chemical we put, and that is TEB, triethylborate, what it was. And on the throttle linkage, every time you start the engine, you give it 1 cc shot of this TEB, it lights off the engine. And it does it up at 80,000 feet just as well. So the designer says, could you send me a sample of that? Kelly said, of course, I'll be happy to send you one. I was in his office when he had just come back from the Paris Air Show, and he said it took them 2 years to figure out what he sent them. Kelly had a team of chemists, and they found something that smelled like, looked like, appeared like TEB, triethylborate, but it wasn't. The Russians came back to him a year and a half later and said, we now have diagnosed exactly what you sent me. It was cat urine. So you didn't give away any secrets. I'd be happy to entertain any questions you have about this magnificent vehicle. Yes, sir.
Sam, you were going to tell us about the M21?
Oh, yes, here the M21. Okay. There is the M21. You notice a drone on top of this Blackbird. It was an A-12 airplane. Now the airplane was flying at 3.2 Mach, and that drone was a rocket-propelled drone. It had cameras on board. It would separate from the A-12, light off its engine, and then would fly about 3,000 miles, about 3.5 Mach at 90,000 feet. It would photograph whatever it was going to photograph. It would then come on a programmed flight back over the Pacific, and the drone would release the cameras that took the photos. They would come down in a parachute. The drone itself would crash, and the cameras on this parachute would be snagged in flight by a C-130 and then brought back a package of the data. If the C-130 missed it, a destroyer would be nearby and would pick it up as well. It was an interesting program, highly, highly classified, beyond what we were doing. And then, unfortunately, after a couple successful missions, there was a flight over the Pacific where the drone was released and the engine had a problem, and it came back and impacted the A-12, destroying everything. The 2 people in the A-12 ejected successfully at 75,000 feet at Mach 3. The pilot survived in the Pacific. The backseater was killed, not by anything other than because he drowned. He hit the water, everything was successful. Unfortunately, with the waves coming about and the canopy of the parachute was coming down on him, and unfortunately he opened his faceplate. The water came into the faceplate, made himself an anchor, and he drowned. The program then after that was canceled by Kelly Johnson. The drones then were put on B-52s launched that way with another rocket propelled. But this was an exciting program, highly dangerous, highly classified, but unique technology. There it was. I'll tell you a kind of a saucy story about the sonic boom. You saw that profile where we came over the ocean. We always went straight over Oceanside. Well, one day we were summoned, and I was selected because I happened to be on the flight in question, because there was a lawsuit in the Superior Court here in San Diego. It was over a sonic boom. So I went to the court hearing, and I thought it was a typical sonic boom problem. Broken glass, cracked ceilings, and so on. I got into court, I looked at the agenda. It was a paternity suit. A paternity suit. So what am I doing here in a paternity suit? Well, it's getting a little saucy, but I'll try it anyway. Forgive me. This couple always had sex on the beach in Oceanside. And every Friday at noontime, they had their affair. This gal refused to allow her friend to use any contraceptives. She said it, he said in court. And he said that the rule was this: at the appropriate time, he would extract. Well, on that given day, we came across and laid the sonic boom. He couldn't extract, and he got the girl pregnant. I said, the judge listened to that and said, case dismissed. This is ridiculous. So much for the sonic boom. As with the missile launches, this was the precursor to the system on the F-14. You all saw Top Gun movie? That was the F-14 using this kind of a radar, but a more advanced version. It was called the AUG-9. And the missile was a larger missile as well. And the F-14 had some amazing success. What it was able to do that we were not able to do in the Blackbird is that we could only track one target at a time. The F-14 had a radar that continued to scan the radar, but didn't stop the antenna to lock on. It did what is called track while scan. So it could track 6 targets simultaneously, and they then demonstrated to launch 6 separate missiles from one aircraft against 6 separate targets successfully. And that's where we developed the system, but the Navy, what the difference was in the Navy version of the F-14 is that it had a radar in the nose of the missile. So when the missile is launched from the aircraft, the crew is independent, they're not doing anything more. But in the Navy version for the F-14, as that missile gets close to the target, it is no longer guided by the airplane or by the mother airplane. Its own little radar now detects the target. A smaller version, right in the nose of the Navy AIM-54 missile. It was a significant advancement, but the basic principles were proven in the Blackbird. I hope I didn't get too saucy on that. Well, the A-12 first went to Okinawa and flew many, many missions over Vietnam. They were then replaced by the SR-71. There was a shoot-off between the A-12 CIA airplanes and the Air Force SR-71s. And it was proven by this shoot-off that the SR-71 was superior. So they continued to fly these missions out of Okinawa over many, many missions over Vietnam. We also did that stuff over Europe. There was another base that we were able to deploy to, was called Mildenhall in England. So the airplanes deployed there and flew missions out of Mildenhall in the European area. A very unique mission was also flown out of New York, where the SR-71 during the Israeli conflicts back in the 1980s, the SR-71 flew reconnaissance missions over Israel, took all the photos back to the United States, and did all of this within a 10-hour mission. For 10 hours, and you're in the airplane, we did multiple air refuelings, which were common for the Blackbirds. By the way, that brings a point. The SR-71 turned out to be superior to the 812 because it not only had photo capability, it also had side-looking radar. So it gave radar images as well as photo images. Any other questions that I might hit you with? Yes, sir.
You mentioned several times about the high skin temperature, which I assume is the air friction at that speed. So did that mean you were actually required to stay in the aircraft for some time after you landed so it could cool down, or were you able to exit the aircraft at that temperature?
Fairly soon after landing, but inside the cockpit, we're in a pressure suit, mind you, and we never touched anything with our flesh. So the pressure suit was always kept very cool, but the instruments that we were touching with the pressure suit were hot.
Mm-hmm.
So by the time we landed and then taxied in, the airplane had a chance to cool down, and we were able to manage pretty well.
And could you also fly at a lower speed prior to landing to avoid that high temperature at landing, or was that not
No, we did. And you know, it's interesting, when we started our descent, and by the way, unique to this airplane from other jets, is that when we take off, we're in afterburner, where you're using a lot of fuel. Most jets use afterburner only for takeoff or to accelerate to go after a target for short periods of time. The Blackbird, we went into afterburner, we stayed in afterburner the entire flight until we were starting our descent. Now in the descent, we had to do a slow descent because the turbine blades in the engine at Mach 3.2 Mach expand, and if you throttle back too quickly, the blades are so wide they would bind. So we could only reduce our speed by 0.2 Mach or so every 30 seconds. So it was a slow descent and a slow acceleration to accommodate the heat problem. And but once we got down to ambient temperatures, down to 20,000, 30,000 feet, it cooled off pretty quickly. Unique airplane. By the way, we used nitrogen to fill our tires, not normal air. It was better, it was less combusting. And our fuel tanks were all sealed with liquid nitrogen. A lot of unique things about this airplane and the radar that were uncommon to most other vehicles. Yes, ma'am.
When did they stop using them, and where are they now? I know there's
Well,
some in display, but
You know, all of them are in display. The ones that are survived are in display around the country. And you'll see one, of course, one is in San Diego. That's an A-12 at the museum. We stopped flying them around 1979, 1980. And the reason was it was fairly costly, and satellites were able to do some of the things that were done by the Blackbird for reconnaissance purposes. The interceptors, they determined we didn't need them because the Russians were de-emphasizing their bomber threats to us, and they didn't feel we needed it. That's kind of questionable in my mind, because we still see Russian bombers coming close to our coastlines out of Alaska or that area. So they're still around, but they're not as much a threat. We're more friendly to them and now, except for Mr. Putin's latest excursions into the world. Oh, that's a good question. I think I had about 125 missions. Two memorable ones were on the first missile launch. We were coming out of Edwards and accelerating to get over the Pacific to launch the missile. And unfortunately, I had a pressure suit problem. And that is, my faceplate was frosting over, so I couldn't see the radar to conduct the mission. So I didn't say anything, no announcement. I flew most of the mission until the missile launched with my faceplate up. All right? Really, that sounds like it would be dangerous, but I'm getting plenty of oxygen. But if we had a rapid decompression, that could be a problem, because at that altitude, 75,000 feet, if without a pressure suit protection, your blood boils in about 20 seconds. Right? So people were kind of excited about that when they came down and told them what happened. And one of the people said, well, all right, we're going to put you in for an air medal. So they sent it up to the headquarters, and they wired back, we're not going to give him an air medal. As a matter of fact, he's going to get disciplinary action. They didn't do it because we had a great success. So that was memorable. The other memorable mission was we were coming back after a high-speed flight right over Edwards Air Force Base. We lost both engines. Well, this thing without engines falls like a rock. We came down and we're heading over the Sierras, and the airplane is just falling down and couldn't get the engine started. Well, pardon me?
Not enough cat urine?
Not enough cat urine. Turns out the flight test engineer on the ground who monitored our flights saved the airplane. Now the tendency if you're coming down without engines is you're descending, but you don't want to descend too fast. You want to keep trying to light off the engine. Well, what you have to do to light that engine off, you have to have high compressor inlet pressure. So when you're coming down and you're raising the nose, not to increase your rate of descent, because you want to wait. Your compressor inlet temperature pressure was low. Well, Johnny Ham, our flight test engineer, kept saying, push forward on the stick. Push forward. Now that's counterintuitive. You're descending, no power. You're going to push forward on the stick and increase your rate of descent? Well, it did increase the rate of descent and got the compressor inlet pressure up, started one engine. We landed at Castle Air Force Base in the San Joaquin Valley, single engine. So that was pretty exciting. We were about 10 or 15 seconds to ejection. I'm glad we didn't, because it would have been the first and only ejection I ever had in any airplane. Oh, you're a very, very good audience and good questions. I want to tell you, it's a pleasure to talk to you, and especially pleasing to be able to be selected to be as part of this program with people who were geniuses and maintenance people who kept it flying.
Military Order of the World War's Silver Patrick Henry Medallion for Patriotic Achievement, presented to Colonel Sam Ursini. Citation: the MOWW General J.P. Holland Chapter is proud to present to you the Silver Patrick Henry Medallion for your superior achievements and dedication to the national defense and security of the United States of America as a U.S. Air Force bombardier/navigator. Your continued leadership, sacrifice, hard work, and dedication to our country continued in the aerospace industry in the development of new aircraft and defense systems. Your endeavors ensure the security and superiority of this great nation, the United States of America. The companions and friends of the General J.P. Holland Chapter wish you the very best in life, and may God bless your future service. Signed, Nicholas S. Hertka, USN Retired Chapter Commander, dated February 7, 2015.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.